There were many factors that led the Allies to victory in World War II. Strategic brilliance certainly played a part, as did errors that left Germany and Japan dangerously overstretched. Individual heroism had its own role to play too. There were heroic individuals on all sides of the war, but some of the most important Allied victories were spurred on by acts of astounding bravery and self-sacrifice. But what about units? What about collections of soldiers who really went above and beyond, who pulled off feats of courage, strength, and skill on their way to decisive victories? Today, we're going to be looking at some of these units on the American side. Join us as we do a rundown of the most badass and impactful American units of the Second World War. Units going above and beyond are epic, don't get me wrong, but what about entire countries? Today's sponsor, Call of War, allows you to take it to that next level. Call of War is a free online PvP strategy game that allows you to choose a real country to lead during World War II and fight up to 100 other players in real-time games that can take weeks to complete. And it requires your astute tactical decision making to win. Create your own armed forces and use secret weapons to turn the tide of battle in your favor. Perhaps you'll even have your own World War II unit, whether they be Air Force, Naval, or Army, that cements itself as elite in the heat of war. As someone who's had a love for PvP strategy games ever since I was a teenager, Call of War amplifies this by being set in the most interesting era of human history. Declare war on your neighbors, forge close alliances with other players, and choose your own strategy when engaging in epic battles, all while playing on either PC or mobile on the same account. For gracing my video today, you get an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and a 1-month premium subscription for free if you click the link below. Only available for 30 days, so make sure to snap it up fast. On December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan struck American soil, opening up a new chapter in the Second World War. While the attack on Pearl Harbor was the first of its kind, it would not be the last. Some 6 months later, the Japanese struck the American Army and naval bases at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, ahead of a planned invasion of this remote yet strategically vital corner of the United States. 43 Americans died on June 3rd and June 4th, 1942. A further 50 were wounded, and the raid destroyed vital infrastructure across the Amaknak Island. Both the Japanese and the Americans lost 11 planes each as the Empire of Japan sought to bring the war home to the USA. But the bombing at Dutch Harbor was just a prelude. Japanese troops were already landing at Attu and Kiska, occupying the two islands ahead of a planned broader invasion across the Aleutians and Alaska. These islands were out of reach of American air power, and so intermediary fuel and maintenance stops were hastily constructed on the way to the targets. But heavy weather made all operations treacherous. This was a very different type of warfare to that seen in Western Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, or the Mediterranean. Even the bitter winters of Stalingrad and Leningrad, and the guerrilla savagery of the Winter War and the Continuation War in Finland did not quite match up to the true Arctic conditions of the Aleutians. A different type of warfare called for a different type of unit. A unit like the Alaskan Scouts, also known as Kastner's Cutthroats. Lawrence Varsi Kastner, also known as Bill, was a military officer and champion fencer who competed in the 1924 Olympic Games. While serving under General Simon Bolivar Buckner in the Alaskan Defense Council, Kastner set about creating a unit that could match the challenges posed by the inhospitable conditions. Working with indigenous Aleuts and Inuits, as well as the hunters and fishermen who knew the area well, Kastner put together one of the most formidable units in the history of the United States Armed Forces. In open battle, few could match the toughness of these men. In the icy tundra of their own backyards, they were unstoppable. In May 1943, the United States unleashed Operation SANDCRAB, the retaking of Attu Island from the Japanese. At the head of this campaign were Kastner's Cutthroats. After rowing a kilometer through inhospitable seas, the Cutthroats reached Beach Red on the island's north shore, attempting to scout out a position for the liberating forces. Using their supreme knowledge of the terrain and relying upon wit, skill, and courage, the Cutthroats landed undetected and gave the signal to the waiting forces. Beach Red was open. While the American landing craft got busy putting their men ashore, the work of Kastner's Cutthroats was far from over. They set off on another scouting mission, searching out Japanese units and alerting the regular troops who would follow. But while the cutthroats moved skillfully over rugged terrain, the regulars were struggling. Lacking the training for this kind of environment and woefully ill-equipped, the liberating units lagged behind the scouts, battling the horrific conditions with more regularity than enemy combatants. The Alaska Scouts now had two roles. One, to carry out reconnaissance and covert attacks on Japanese positions. Two, to keep the American units alive. They performed ably on both counts, demonstrating their skill, hardiness, and downright badassery as they went about securing the island. It was an Alaska Scout diversion that enabled the American forces to take strategic Japanese positions in the Holtz Valley, effectively ending meaningful Japanese resistance on the island. With Holtz gone, the Japanese had nowhere to hide, and the Alaska Scouts were natural hunters. Encircled, battered, and demoralized, the Japanese mounted one last suicide attack, killing many Americans but sustaining massive losses themselves. Attu was back in American hands. Kiska, abandoned by the fleeing Japanese, would follow shortly after. Often forgotten, yet strategically crucial, the campaign had been won, thanks to the ingenuity, courage, and strength of Kastner's cutthroats. We're heading back to Hawaii for this one, the location of Pearl Harbor and the surprise attack that dragged the United States into World War II and into direct conflict with Japan. But Hawaii was significant for another reason too. It's home to a huge Japanese-American population. Of the island chain's pre-war population of 400,000, around 150,000 were of Japanese descent. This made the policy of internment, practiced across the western United States, basically impossible. Rather than enter what were essentially concentration camps like their lower 48 cousins, Hawaii's Japanese community went about business as usual, and many of the younger men were drafted into the armed forces. Around 2/3 of the 442nd Regiment were second-generation Japanese Americans from Hawaii, while the rest were Japanese Americans from the mainland. To say this regiment was an effective fighting force was something of an understatement. These guys got to work in a big way. Fighting under a banner displaying the torch held by the Statue of Liberty, the 442nd saw action in Italy, France, and Germany during the final 2 years of the war, distinguishing themselves in campaign after campaign. Their motto, "Go for broke," proved devastatingly accurate, and the men of the 442nd picked up more than 4,000 Purple Hearts, recognizing a wound picked up in the face of the enemy. The regiment also won an astonishing 21 Medals of Honor, 560 Silver Stars, as well as 28 Oak Leaf Clusters signifying a second award, and more than 4,000 Bronze Stars. When they disbanded in 1946, the 442nd Regiment was the most decorated unit of its size, not only in the Second World War, but in the whole of United States military history. Truly a formidable force. The Kokoda Trail in the densely forested southeast of Papua New Guinea has passed into legend, and thousands of tourists walk this trail each year, remembering the fighting that took place here during the Second World War. Tough as it may be, the Kokoda Trail must have seemed like heaven to the 32nd Infantry Regiment hacking and gouging their way along Kappa Kappa, Kokoda's parallel trail. In 42 days, 900 members of the division trekked the 170-kilometer trail, attempting to outflank the Japanese occupying the much shorter Kokoda Trail. Despite the hellish conditions and the fact that illness and disease were sweeping through the ranks, the 32nd was successful. But by the end of the war, the division would have taken 66% casualties due to illness, on top of their combat losses. The reputation of this collection of soldiers as among the toughest in the entire armed forces was sealed, and no units attempted this crossing again. As the war entered its final phases, the fighting was still heavy both in the European and Pacific theaters. The 32nd Division reached later in November 1944, joining the thick of the action and remaining right there on the front lines until later completely fell on New Year's Eve. There was no let-up for the 32nd, and the division found themselves once again fighting in brutal terrain at the Battle of Villa Verde Trail. For 6 weeks, the men battled their way up the 27-mile trail, executing remarkable feats of heroism and strength in the process. 4 medals of honor were awarded to the 32nd for their incredible work securing the trail, work that would be instrumental in securing the strategic Cagayan Valley. In a final moment of glory, it was the 32nd who took custody of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the general commanding the Japanese defense of the Philippines, after his surrender in September 1945. This was fitting for a unit that was one of the first to engage after the United States joined the war in 1941 and one of the last to disengage at its end. After spending 654 days in combat, more than any other American unit, the 32nd received 11 medals of honor. 7,268 of these brave troops were killed in action. Reconnaissance units. These fighting forces are designed to observe, gather information, and evade detection. For most units of this type, this means compromise, hanging back and disengaging when outgunned, or instead, engaging and suffering combat losses as a result. For one unit, however, there was no such compromise. This unit was the Alamo Scouts. A small 138-man unit of the United States 6th Army, the Alamo Scouts were put together by General Walter Kruger, who needed an elite reconnaissance unit to support the Allied troops in their advance through the Pacific. Serving in New Guinea and the Philippines, the Alamo Scouts engaged in unorthodox missions that made them the precursors of modern Special Forces outfits, and also acted as Kruger's own bodyguard. These warriors, named for the heroic defense of the Alamo against the Mexican armies of Santa Anna in 1836, certainly did not compromise. Battling their way through an unforgiving environment, the Alamo Scouts were not the only eyes and ears of the 6th Army. They were its claws and fangs too when they needed to be. In New Guinea, they liberated 197 Allied prisoners of war who were being held by the Japanese. In the Philippines, they liberated over 500, using disguise, deception, cunning, and a whole lot of bravery to infiltrate enemy positions. At one stage, Alamo Scouts conducted observation details within a few hundred yards of the prison camp's perimeter and were never detected by the enemy guards. Over the course of the war, the Alamo Scouts ran 110 missions behind enemy lines and were instrumental in the successful American campaigns of 1944 and 1945. What's even more astounding is this: they didn't lose a single man. Not one. No compromise, no quarter. This was the Alamo Scouts to a T. Had the war ended differently, with an Allied invasion of the Japanese homelands, it's likely the Alamo Scouts would have been back in action, reconnoitering Kyushu ahead of a monumental landing. That day never came, however, and the Alamo Scouts were disbanded in Kyoto in 1945. The Battle of Guadalcanal from August 1942 to February 1943 was a huge turning point in the war. Defeated at the Battle of Midway in 1942, the Japanese had somehow continued to advance, and it took an almighty effort from the Allies at Guadalcanal to liberate the Solomon Islands and bring that advance to a halt. Now, it was the Allies' turn to go on the offensive. But Guadalcanal had taught the Americans a crucial lesson. Deep penetration units were going to be vital in horrendous terrain, smashing the Japanese lines in key locations and sowing panic among their forces. British and Indian forces had the Chindits, under the command of Brigadier Ord Wingate. Now, the Americans needed one too. The 5,307th Composite Unit was born, soon to be known under the much snappier title Merrill's Marauders. A West Point graduate, an MIT alumnus, and a Japanese speaker after serving as the military attaché in Tokyo, Frank Merrill had all the credentials to succeed in the American armed forces. He served under Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines and was actually in Burma when the Japanese invaded in 1941. After the Allies achieved victory thousands of miles away in Guadalcanal, Merrill was given command of a new volunteer force modelled on Wingate's Chindits. Merrill, by now a brigadier general, oversaw the training of this elite unit, and 3 battalions of the 5,307th were deployed in Burma in February of 1944. Merrill's Marauders were devastatingly effective, despite the hostile conditions they found themselves in. The unit fought in 5 major battles across Burma, from Wolalbum and Shadzup to Inkanatong and Napumga, and finally, Machina. All in all, the Marauders fought the Japanese in at least 32 separate engagements. Combat, disease, and horrific terrain all took their toll. GABRIEL, who served in the Marauders, would later say, "There was a point in time we had gotten where the ones who were not alive were the lucky ones. I've seen them look down at one that was in very bad shape and say, 'You lucky so-and-so.'" When the unit was disbanded on August 10th, 1944, a week after the fall of Machina to the Allies, only 130 Marauders remained fit for battle out of 2,997 volunteers across 3 divisions. In 5 months behind enemy lines, this elite unit traversed more jungle terrain than any other American division. Each and every one of Merrill's Marauders received a Bronze Star for their bravery and tenacity during the conflict, a true testament to just how badass this force was. General Merrill would survive the war, but the toll it took on his health was enormous. He suffered a heart attack in March 1944, leaving Colonel Charles N. Hunter in charge, but continued to serve in the armed forces even after the end of the war, first in the Philippines and then at the headquarters of the 6th Army in California, where his Marine platoons would suppress a prison riot and foil an attempted escape at Alcatraz in 1946. Retiring from the army in 1948, Merrill entered politics but passed away in 1955, aged only 52. GABRIEL, who spoke so movingly about his experiences, would become the last of Merrill's Marauders and passed away in December 2022, aged 101. The morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of mainland Europe and the beginning of the end for Hitler and Nazi Germany. With Soviet forces already pushing in from the east, and with Italy falling in the south, the pincers were now in place. They just had to swing shut. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. On that morning in June, the pincers were not yet in place. Everything still hung in the balance. The Normandy landings had to be a success. But at Omaha Beach, east of Utah on the battle's west flank, success looked a long way away. The bulk of the first wave was made up of companies from the 116th Infantry, and each had its own strategic objective. The 116th fought gallantly, but luck was against them from the very start. Rough seas sent some landing crafts off course and sank others. The artillery bombardment, targeted further inland out of fear of shelling the Allies' own troops, had barely scratched the German defenses. Heavy German machine gun fire cut down soldier after soldier, often detonating the explosives carried by engineer units. General Omar Bradley, dismayed by what he saw and appalled by the loss of life, considered throwing in the towel. Taking withering fire from the German units above, the 116th Infantry companies had nowhere to go. Abandoning the beachhead maybe would save Allied lives, but it would mean those lives already lost would have been wasted. General Norman Dutch Cotter of the 29th Infantry Division had other ideas. "Rangers," he said, "lead the way." The 5th Ranger Battalion did exactly that. They pushed on through the sea wall, navigating the tangles of barbed wire that lay beyond it, and set about scaling the heights that overlooked the beaches. Pillboxes poured down machine gun fire from above, while mortar teams rained destruction upon the advancing Rangers, but still, the 5th Battalion did not let up. In an astonishing feat of bravery and tenacity, 5th Battalion Rangers advanced 6 kilometers and took the strategic town of Ville-sur-Mer. A critical breach was opened in the German defenses, supporting troops from the 116th Infantry were able to advance, and the balance of D-Day began to swing in the Allies' favor. But the 5th wasn't the only Ranger Battalion on Omaha Beach that morning. The 2nd Battalion was there too, as well as members of the Provisional Rangers group, demonstrating incredible courage as they fought to open up the beaches for subsequent landing waves. Companies D, E, and F had a particularly difficult objective that morning. They landed at Pointe-Du-Hoc, a small headland between Omaha and Utah. Here, they encountered brutal resistance, and half of their number were either killed or wounded during the landing. "I was the first one out," said Captain Richard Merrill of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. "The 7th man was the next one to get across the beach without being hit. All the ones in between were hit. 2 were killed, 3 were injured. That's how lucky you had to be." Despite the horrors they found upon landing, D, E, and F companies got to work. One of their objectives was a German machine gun position that was laying a flurry of fire across the open beach. This position had to go, but knocking it out meant scaling a 27-meter cliff. Heroically, the 2nd Battalion did exactly that, eliminating the position as well as a battery of captured French artillery that was trained on Utah Beach to the west. It would be 3 days before the 2nd and 5th Battalions linked up with one another. Both had sustained massive casualties, and both had displayed gallantry and ruthless fighting spirit on the beaches of Normandy. Without the Rangers, the story of Omaha Beach on June that morning in 1944 might have ended very differently. Both units fought on, advancing across France, Belgium, and into Germany. The 2nd Rangers and 5th Rangers were deactivated following the fall of Germany in 1945, but their deeds live on in history and in legend. To this day, the US Rangers are among the most formidable fighting forces on the planet, and the actions of the 2nd and 5th Battalions on D-Day have been instrumental in building this reputation. From every corner of the map and from every campaign and every theatre of the war, there's stories of horror and of heroism. Individuals who went above and beyond the call of duty. Units that showed exactly what they were capable of when all seemed lost. With so many of these stories, we were only ever going to scratch the surface in this video. But I'm sure you'll agree, the stories we covered here today are nothing short of jaw-dropping. Whether in the frozen wastes of the Aleutians or in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, these units fought against all odds. Many were victorious, but most would pay a heavy price for this victory. So, what do you think? Are these the most badass, the most effective, the most formidable American units of the Second World War, and possibly of American war history? Are there any other units we've missed from our list? Units you'd like us to cover in a future video? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Once again, big thanks to Call of War for sponsoring the video. Don't lose time in getting your head start in this World War II based free online PvP strategy game, and engage in epic battles to take over the world with 13,000 gold and a 1-month free subscription if you accept the offer within 30 days. Click the link in the description, choose your country, and fight your way to victory.